My relationship with Gwen needed a spark as our 4th wedding anniversary approached. We noticed a change in our relationship, apparently due to Gwen's new role as a project manager, taking on additional responsibilities while her boss recovered from a heart attack. The stress increased, and Gwen's normally well-controlled OCD began to worsen. She spent more and more time at work, and we had less and less time together. At first, Gwen was grateful for the small gestures I made to help her relax, rubbing her feet, tidying up the house, doing the laundry. But about 6 weeks after the promotion, it all seemed to lose its significance. My attempts to comfort and help her were met with rejection, and I felt like a stranger in my own home. Desperate for advice, I turned to friends who had been married for a long time, including my friend Paul. "Friend, I can't believe what you're telling me. It's okay for couples to go through difficulties, but you and Gwen have only been married for 4 years. Are you absolutely sure?" "You didn't dream it," Paul said, shocked. When I told him about some of the hurtful things Gwen had said recently, he went from surprise to complete shock and supported me as a friend. "Maybe she dumped you. I cannot understand how and when this could have happened. She spends a lot of time in the office, overseeing the transition to a new platform and is responsible for the project. This project is changing the course of her career. Gwen is too focused and single-minded to risk missing it by escaping to some romantic retreat. It looks like it is, my friend. Your wife is completely absorbed in her work, and you are just a victim of her ambitions. I've been thinking about it, but something doesn't add up in this situation," Paul said thoughtfully, staring at the remains of his beer. Knowing him so well, I could almost hear the internal discussion raging in his head: have another drink or go home to your wife and kids. A faint smile flashed across his face as he came to a decision and signaled the bartender to pay the bill. Paul's love for his family was obvious. After paying the bill, he said a few parting words to me. "Len, don't rush to blame Gwen for anything, especially when she's working tirelessly under enormous pressure to complete this project. An unsupportive spouse is terrible." "Don't be such a spouse," Paul said. The man sitting next to me seemed to react to Paul's comment. I strained to hear his words. "An unsupportive spouse is bad, but an unfaithful spouse is even worse," he said. I decided to trust but also to check. The following Saturday, Gwen was stuck in the office setting up new equipment. I called her in the afternoon and offered to bring pizza for lunch. Gwen gratefully accepted my offer but asked me to bring 3 large pizzas because there were 4 hungry people in the office. I took their orders and went to Gwen's office to deliver the pizza. Upon arrival, Gwen introduced me to Janice, whom I already knew from the previous holiday party, and 2 new guys, Brad and Clark, who had recently been hired. While the 5 of us were enjoying pizza, the atmosphere was relaxed and only Brad seemed more restrained, which was typical for techies, so I didn't pay much attention to it. Although I didn't show it, I wanted to know how Gwen spent her time away from home. It was clear that she was completely dedicated to the project, always staying late at the office and not going anywhere. 3 weeks passed, and I found myself at home, looking forward to Gwen's return. There were no signs of misconduct on her part, but our emotional and physical connection had not yet been restored. Deciding to try a different approach, I changed tactics. The aroma of dinner wafted from the stove, a bottle of Merlot was uncorked, the table was elegantly set with flickering candles and a vase of irises. At exactly 5:30, Gwen came into the room. Her eyes widened at the sight of me, a smile spreading across her face as she kissed me and took off her coat and shoes. "Len, that's so thoughtful," she said. I poured her a glass of wine. "Go freshen up and be ready for dinner in 10 minutes. We'll need to discuss something." Her gaze met mine, and I saw the gears turning in her head. When Gwen came down the stairs, a delicious dinner was waiting for her: juicy medallions, baked potatoes, and crispy asparagus. We struck up a conversation, discussing how our days had gone, savoring every bite. After finishing her meal, Gwen leaned back in her chair, anticipation in her eyes. I took out the envelope and carefully opened it. Gwen, I understand the difficulties you've faced over the past 5 months, and I know your appeal date is approaching in just 2 weeks, on Saturday. I think it's important for us to spend time together after the appeal is filed, given that you'll need to stay close for at least 2 weeks after submitting your application. I've arranged for us to take a week off, which will begin in a month. We have to make a decision within 24 hours, and if I don't cancel it by 4 o'clock tomorrow, we'll lose 25% of our deposit. I shared a brochure about the Caribbean resort from where we'll fly first class to the Dominican Republic. The resort offers an all-inclusive vacation for couples. Leaning back in my chair, I watched Gwen, who looked from me to the brochure in her hands. After a moment of silence, she finally spoke, tears in her eyes. Len, this is amazing. I would love to go on vacation with you. The timing couldn't be better. Everything should be ready for our departure. Thank you. The next 4 weeks seemed to drag on endlessly. Gwen's project was completed, the transformation was successful, and there were only minor problems that were quickly solved. I parked the car in a secluded parking lot, and we boarded a shuttle to the terminal. We only had 2 small suitcases, my backpack, and her luggage bag. I planned to wear shorts, a polo shirt, and swimming trunks all week. Gwen had 3 sundresses, 2 pairs of shorts, a couple of t-shirts, and a carry-on bag. After receiving our boarding passes, we stood in line for first-class security control when a familiar face approached us. Gwen was visibly surprised and likely spoke louder than she intended. I need to talk to you, Gwen. At first, I was annoyed, thinking it was work-related. Can't this conversation wait until Gwen gets back from vacation? But Brad ignored my question. Gwen, we need to talk right now. Before I could answer, Gwen intervened, looking upset. Len, please continue. I'll sort this out now and come to you. It won't take long. I hesitated, but Gwen insisted. Please, Len, go. I'll come to you. Turning to Brad, she looked incredibly angry. Realizing that staying put would only delay the inevitable, I glanced at my watch and went through security. When I reached the gate, I noticed the plane had started landing. Feeling the need to drink, I knew exactly where to go. Unfortunately, I made the second biggest mistake of my life. Calmly walking along the first-class passenger path, I confidently presented my boarding pass, walked down the aisle, and settled into my seat. I didn't give them a chance to finish before quickly asking for a double bourbon, still carbonated. To my surprise, the flight attendant returned with my drink in less than 30 seconds, indicating I must have politely asked. Thanking her, I took a long sip, feeling the warmth of the liquid moving down my throat, calming my mind and heart. As the last passengers boarded, I tried to call Gwen, but there was no answer, and the call immediately went to voicemail. I sent a message asking, "Where are you?" but got no response. I sent another message, "You don't have much time. Where are you?" Completely immersed in my phone, I didn't notice the cabin door closing and the plane beginning to move. At that moment, a message from Gwen appeared on my screen, "I'm sorry." The flight attendant stood next to me and gently reminded me, "Sir, you need to turn off your phone." Her voice brought me out of my daze. "Can I come out? This is an urgent situation." "What's the urgency?" "My wife missed the plane, and I'm afraid she might have left me." "I'm very sorry, sir, but we cannot return to the boarding gate for this reason. Please consider how this will affect other passengers." My expression must have betrayed my desperation as she handed me a small bottle of bourbon before starting a safety demonstration. 5 agonizing hours passed. The plane landed at Punta Cana Airport in the Dominican Republic, and I wasted no time calling Gwen. No wonder she didn't answer the phone. After completing the call, I saw a missed call message and listened to the voicemail she had left. "Len, I'm really sorry. Please read the letter I sent you. It will explain everything. I'm sorry I was a coward. You deserve more. With a heavy heart, I opened the email on my phone. Gwen left a message. The plane was preparing to land. The timing couldn't have been worse. After getting off the plane, I quickly found an empty seat and opened Gwen's letter. She confessed, "Len, I'm really sorry. I thought I could leave you and start over. I've been dating Brad behind your back for the last 4 months. Until you suggested we leave together." Her message was long, full of apologies, excuses, and details about her infidelity. I sat trying to stay calm and read the note. Passing through customs, I obviously caught the eye of one of the agents. Before I knew it, I was in a small room with 2 agents and my luggage. Fortunately, one of them spoke English, and I begged him to read the letter from my wife. The humiliation of being seen as a devoted husband was almost unbearable. I was released after an hour. When I arrived at the resort, it was already evening, and I quickly boarded the shuttle. By the time I reached my destination, it was almost 8 p.m. I wanted to have a drink and go to bed, but the booming blows in my head did not subside. When I tried to check into my room, the receptionist asked, "Where is your wife?" "Unfortunately, my wife couldn't come," I said. "I'm very sorry, sir. This is a resort for couples, and I can't let you check in without your wife," she explained. "I've spent $5,000 for a week, and I need a room," I insisted. "Unfortunately, the hotel cannot make an exception for you," the night manager explained. Despite this, he kindly offered to accommodate me at another resort nearby where there were available rooms. He even arranged for a messenger to take me there. When I tried to check in at the second resort, my credit card was blocked. Then I tried to use my backup card, but it was rejected too. Worried, I tried to contact Gwen for an explanation, but got no response. After calling both banks' hotlines, I received a message that the cards had been cancelled. Disappointed, I contacted Gwen by text message and asked why the cards had been cancelled. 10 minutes later, she replied that Brad had suggested canceling the cards, believing they wouldn't be needed since the resort was prepaid and operated on an all-inclusive system. Upon receiving her reply, I realized that my sudden outburst of words and curses must have caught the hotel employee off guard. Fortunately, the only advantage of that day was that I had over $600 in cash with me. I used some of it to pay for the night and still had more than half left. I went into my room, which was probably the worst $300 a night room I'd ever stayed in, and sat down in an armchair to collect my thoughts. Unfortunately, I couldn't access my bank accounts. The next morning, I needed to contact the bank, and I decided to call my brother in Denver for help. After explaining the situation and assuring him and his wife of the seriousness of my intentions, I finally enlisted their support. With their help, I was able to solve my urgent problem, and my brother agreed to go to his bank early the next morning and send money to the nearest Western Union. After that, I contacted the airline to inquire about my ticket. I realized that my ticket was non-transferable, as I had opted for the cheapest option, which also meant that the tickets were not refundable. I was informed that if I wanted to purchase return tickets for cash, I would have to do it in person at the terminal. The earliest flight from Punta Cana was scheduled for Tuesday evening. Then I sat down to read Gwen's letter one last time. "I'm sorry that I thought I could leave you and start over with a clean slate. I've been dating Brad behind your back for the last 4 months. Until you suggested we leave together, I never intended to betray you. But as the project became more demanding and I spent less and less time with you and more with Brad, I realized that I was relying on him for emotional support. I didn't plan for this, but it turned out that way. Although I resisted for several weeks after his first kiss, I eventually gave in after a long working Saturday. In the absence of the rest of the team, I finally succumbed to his advances and betrayed you. I couldn't help but wonder why you didn't notice me slipping away, why you didn't notice my growing attraction to Brad. Now, as I write this letter, I understand how many times you tried to call me, how many times you asked me what happened, and how you could help. It's too late now to appreciate all the efforts you've put in to save our marriage, like booking a week at a resort to reunite. When you mentioned the week we're going to spend together to work on our relationship, it was like you opened my eyes. At that moment, I realized that I wanted to be married to you. The next day, I ended my relationship with Brad. Although it was difficult for him to come to terms with it, despite his persistent attempts to resume our relationship, I mostly resisted. I admit I'm weak. I succumbed to temptation when I started an affair with him. I was weak when I let him repeatedly persuade me to say goodbye to him in recent weeks, and I was weak when he convinced me to skip our flight and the planned week together. I hope this week you will find time to relax and clear your mind. Brad suggested that you would enjoy spending a week at a luxury resort in paradise, with delicious food, lots of drinks, sun, and a break from work. He thinks it's the perfect way to forget about everything. I almost left and got on the plane, but when he showed up at the airport, he said, "You will find out everything about our affair. You probably won't want to be around me after that." It was clear, and I couldn't understand how hard it was to sit next to you for 5 hours and feel your contempt. I needed a week to realize my actions. I'll try to call you when I get back next Sunday. My things should be out of our house by then. Please don't dismiss me. I know I've crossed a line beyond which I can't be your loving wife, but I can't stand your hate. With remorse, Gwen. I almost deleted the email, but in the end, I decided to keep it. At least it answered one question. The reason I didn't see Gwen outside was because she was most likely spending time with that jerk from the office. The bar was open for another hour, and I had plenty of time to go downstairs, have a drink, and toast my unfaithful wife at the end of our marriage. My father always emphasized to me and my brothers and sisters the danger of drunkenness. I listened to his instructions before graduation and again on my 21st birthday. Drinking less has never solved any problems, and even worse, there are 3 types of problem drinkers: whiny, aggressive, and overly cheerful. Avoid being one of them. Drink alcohol slowly and systematically. Appreciate the thrill, but always keep in mind the limits of what is allowed. If I catch you driving regardless of your age, I will take your car and punish you. Interestingly, my father was not a tea lover. He could drink beer like any other person, but I've never seen my dad get drunk, act stupid, or drive after more than 1 beer. He followed his own rules. I knew I would only have 2 beers at the bar before returning to my room, but I intended to enjoy each of them. After finishing my first glass, I looked around the bar. There were 2 single guys, 4 couples including, I think, a same-sex couple, and a 5th couple who were dancing and trying to impress each other. The bartender caught my eye as I was looking around the room, and we laughed. The man on the dance floor probably weighed over 132 pounds, and his partner looked like olive oil. At least his wife didn't leave him at the airport, I thought to myself. It made me think about my own situation. How did I screw it up? Did I really mess it up? Were the 5 years that Gwen and I spent together, including 4 years of marriage, just an illusion? I didn't believe it. It seemed to me that a few months ago, we really loved each other and were happy. As I sipped my second glass of beer, memories of our meeting 5 years ago at the Chiefs baseball game flashed through my mind. Gwen stood out with her Ryne Sandberg t-shirt, surrounded by a group of girls. Despite the Chiefs' affiliation with the St. Louis Cardinals, there were many Cubs fans in the area. I took a seat next to them, deciding to get to know the tall blonde with the beautiful face and long legs. After buying all 4 of them a beer, I used Gwen's t-shirt to start a conversation. "You look a little young to be wearing a Sandberg t-shirt. He was before your time, right?" "Sandberg was my dad's favorite player, and he gave me this jersey," she replied, taking my hand. "I'm Thomas Linder, but everyone calls me Len," I introduced myself. "I'm Gwen Harper, but everyone calls me Gwen," she answered. She mentioned that she was a senior at Bradley University, majoring in information technology. I told her that I had graduated from college 2 years ago and now work for Caterpillar in the engineering department. The conversation somehow returned to Sandberg's t-shirts. Dad said the 5 best days of his life were marrying Mom, the birth of me and my brother Pete, the Cubs draft, and the day Ryne Sandberg hit 2 home runs off Bruce Sutter. Did your father play for the Cubs? He didn't make the main team, but he spent 2 years in AWA, Iowa. It's still a great achievement, I replied. After Gwen and I chatted the whole game, she left with her friends and gave me her phone number, urging me to call. I called the next day, and that same weekend, we went on a date, marking the beginning of our romantic relationship. It took several months before Gwen finally spent the night with me. Not only was she stunning, but she also played sports and excelled at it. Graduating from high school with honors was just one of her many achievements. But there was one potential obstacle in our relationship. Her friends, especially her father, were extremely competitive when it came to their sports teams. In the pub, I watched my alma mater Purdue fight Bradley in a men's basketball game. Although I loved it when Purdue won, I knew I couldn't control the outcome. But that night, every time Bradley scored, one of Gwen's male friends would tease me and greet the others at the table. Fortunately, Bradley came out the winner, and I was told that I had to buy the next round. Even though I was upset, I stood my ground and insisted that the winner should buy drinks. Despite my best efforts, I failed to make a good impression on Gwen's friends that evening. Gwen was silent and didn't seem to attach any importance to the situation. I had no idea that meeting her father would be even more frightening. Thanksgiving came when it had been 4 months since Gwen and I had been dating. When I entered their home in Arlington Heights, I was warmly greeted by her parents. Despite Gwen's usual intelligence, she was wrong to think that I had dodged a bullet in communicating with her friends. As soon as Gwen introduced us, she playfully warned, "Be careful, Dad, he's a Cardinals fan." I couldn't help but notice a slight grimace on the old man's face. It was 2011, just 5 years before the Cubs would finally get to the World Series and win it. 10 years earlier, the Cardinals had reached the World Series 3 times and won twice. It's understandable why this topic might be a touchy one for a Cubs fan, especially one who was once part of their farm system. I was desperate to make a good impression on my girlfriend's family, so I tried to downplay my love for the Cardinals. But let's be honest, I've never been the most loyal fan. For the next 5 years, right up to that day at the airport, it seemed to me that my girlfriend's father was constantly judging me, waiting for me to slip up again. Let's just say he wasn't the most pleasant person. I wonder if he's happy with how things turned out, but that's a story for another time. After Thanksgiving, Gwen and I returned to Peoria and went back to our usual business. Gwen, who was preparing to graduate from college, had already gotten a job at State Farm in Bloomington. I made a decision and called Mr. Harper to ask for his daughter's hand in marriage. Soon after that, I bought a ring. Just 2 days before Christmas, I finally introduced Gwen to my family, who immediately welcomed her with delight. On Christmas Eve, I got down on one knee and proposed to Gwen, and with tears in her eyes, she said yes. We wasted no time planning our wedding, which was scheduled for the end of July, exactly 1 year after that special day in Dozer Park. We hadn't officially lived together yet, but Gwen often stayed with me for 4 or 5 nights a week. Her family didn't approve of premarital cohabitation, so we found a small farmhouse that could be rented between Peoria and Bloomington, where we both worked. After getting married on July 30th and spending our honeymoon in Miami Beach, we moved into this house. But 4 months ago, everything went wrong, and I was left alone, thousands of miles from home, drinking Dominican beer. After the bartender rang the bell announcing the last call, I finished my second Presidente and thanked him for giving me a quiet place to think. After leaving a generous tip, I returned to my room. On Monday morning, I called our bank and found out that all 3 of our accounts were closed. I went to the Western Union office to pick up the money that my brother had sent. Taking a taxi to the airport, I bought a ticket for Tuesday's flight, making sure that it would not take off earlier. Returning to the resort in the middle of the day, I decided to extend my room reservation until the next day. Not knowing what to do next, I decided to give up alcohol and, wearing swimming trunks, ran along the beach and then swam in the warm sea. After that, I returned to the room, feeling annoyed at the sight of numerous couples in a romantic embrace. In order not to get even more annoyed, I ordered room service for dinner, preferring to have a quiet dinner alone. I spent the next 5 hours immersed in a Vince Flynn paperback I bought at a hotel boutique. The next day was filled with a long run, swimming, checking out of the hotel, lunch in the city, visiting the airport, and 7 hours spent on another spy novel. After boarding the plane, I tried to fall asleep without success, after which I had a 2.5-hour flight home. Now that I was in my house, I was faced with an empty room since most of Gwen's things had already been taken out. I woke up at noon on Wednesday, collapsed on the bed. I contacted my friend from his office, who gave me the name of a lawyer. After talking to Henry Abbott, I made an appointment for Thursday afternoon. Henry, as he preferred to be called, was distinguished by his professional behavior. Although he did not seek to become my best friend, he assured me that he would provide reliable representation and protection. After listening to my story, he promised to prepare the necessary documents for consideration by Monday if I could provide all the required information by Friday afternoon. I hit the road with a complete list of necessary details and tasks that needed to be completed by Friday afternoon. Henry turned out to be incredibly organized and told me to document every event from Brad's first appearance at the airport to the moment he received the documents. He stressed that I was in a foreign country without any help and demanded a detailed inventory of our property, all expenses incurred in Washington and on the way back, as well as a list of things missing from our house after my return. My haste in processing the documents did not matter in the end. On Monday morning, while I was waiting at work for a call from Abbott's office saying that the documents were ready for my signature, my secretary came into my office. "Len, a man came to see you, but he won't reveal the reason," she said. "It's all right, Sarah, it'll go to him," I replied. Henry had warned me that Gwen might be the first to file. He convinced me that it would be useful to know about their intentions. Besides, it would put me in the position of a victim. She would be the initiator of the divorce, not me. Although this was quite logical from a legal point of view, obtaining divorce papers was still painful. After reading the papers, I felt a surge of anger and almost gave in to the urge to call Gwen and speak out. Fortunately, I managed to restrain myself and not fall into this trap. One of my friends shared a similar experience when his wife's lawyer tried to provoke him in the same way. As a result, he called his estranged wife and got into a heated argument with her. During the court session, a court order banning contact was unexpectedly issued, which served as additional evidence of his aggressive actions. I quickly handed over the documents to my lawyer, realizing that the legal battle was about to begin. 2 months later, my lawyer and I found ourselves in the courtroom, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the judge. When she finally entered the hall, my heart sank. She was a female judge, and I couldn't help but fear the worst after hearing stories about unfair treatment of men in divorce court. I braced myself for the worst. Gwen's lawyer listed a number of demands while Gwen didn't even look at me. During the negotiations, I noticed that idiot Brad wasn't in the courtroom, a strategic decision on their part. My lawyer outlined our version, which was already known to the judge. All the information had been previously studied and analyzed. After Gwen's lawyer had the opportunity to respond, we issued a final rebuttal. The judge asked Gwen a question using her maiden name, as her lawyer had done. "Harper, you have not accused Mr. Linder of cruelty. Did you just fall in love with Mr. Bradley Parker and decide to leave your husband because of your feelings for another man?" Gwen and her lawyer thought for a moment, and then she replied, "Yes, Your Honor. There was no cruelty. Thank you for your honesty. I will not tolerate people in my courtroom who use false statements about cruelty for selfish purposes." She paused briefly to review her notes. "The court has decided on a divorce with immediate effect. Alimony has not been assigned. Both sides will keep their pension funds and personal belongings. The jointly acquired property will be divided equally. As part of the settlement, Miss Harper will reimburse Mr. Linder for expenses totaling $9,000, including expenses for his portion of the spoiled vacation, expenses during his stay, and a return air ticket. Miss Harper will pay all the attorney's fees of both parties and allocate $3,200 for half of the couple's rent for 7 months after her departure until the lease of the house they rented expires. The judge's gaze fell on Gwen, and she said sternly, "Girl, you claim that you love your husband. If that's how you treat a loved one, then I shudder to think about how you treat those you don't love." I was completely shocked by this turn of events. Of the $20,000 that Gwen had saved for a house, she had to give me almost $16,000. As the lawyer and I were leaving the courtroom, I suddenly heard a scream behind me. Turning around, I saw Brad sitting on a bench. He tried to get up, but I quickly walked over to him. "You know she'll cheat on you too," I said before I left. Outside the courthouse, I offered Henry lunch. We went into a diner on the other side of the street. I was stunned when I saw that the judge was a woman. I was afraid I was going to get in trouble. "You are wrong on 2 points. There will always be some elderly judge who will be charmed by a beautiful wife and he will provide her with a farm. We can't find a better judge than Judy Carter. You knew that we would be speaking in her courtroom. Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want you to have false hopes or be overconfident in case she was going to check on you carefully," Henry added. "Judge Carter has been happily married for 40 years and is a highly respected lawyer. Barry Carter works as a machinist at a local machine shop supplying parts to Caterpillar. Despite his impressive golf skills, he remains humble and unassuming at the club, constantly winning tournaments with 5 strokes." Henry paused to take a sip of coffee. "Let me tell you one last story and emphasize that not all marriages are doomed and that there are beautiful women in the world." At the country club dance, Judy and Barry were sitting at the same table with my wife, me, and another couple. Judy, ignoring Barry, was approached by a famous man who owns a car dealership in the city and invited her to dance. Barry remained humble but at the same time respected his wife enough to let her figure out the situation. Judy sharply began to criticize the man. She asked, "Have you ever been taught etiquette? No decent man will ask a lady to dance without first asking her escort. Leave now, and I hope you never end up in my courtroom. If you do, ask for another judge, because I can't guarantee you a fair trial." The judge kissed her husband affectionately, knowing full well that some people underestimate him because he works with his hands. Having laughed at this story, I couldn't help but admire Judge Carter's unique presence. "You stand out among lawyers," I remarked, feeling the need to clarify that I was not criticizing his profession. Henry grinned back and said, "My father worked on the cat assembly line for over 30 years, and my mother devoted herself to raising 5 children. When I entered the faculty of law, Dad hugged me, congratulated me, and gave me advice: don't turn into a jerk." After lunch, I once again expressed my gratitude to him, after which we parted. Despite well-intentioned attempts by friends and colleagues to date me, I was not ready for a new relationship. My heart had not yet recovered from the last rupture. Instead, I found solace in visiting local bars, where I was known as a regular. I had some free time, so I went dancing, but I quickly realized what it means to be a ladies' man. One evening, I was having a nice time in the company of an amazing woman. As we were leaving, I noticed a faint mark on her left hand where a ring had recently been. Unable to resist, I asked, "Are you married?" She hesitated, looked at me with an astonished expression on her face, and only then admitted, "Yes, but my husband is away now." "Where is he?" "He is in Afghanistan, serving in the army." "You should be ashamed of yourself. Your husband is risking his life for his country, and you want to betray him?" She started crying and then collapsed on the sidewalk. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm bad," she said. I helped her up, and she looked at me with tears in her eyes. She then tried to justify her actions by saying, "My husband has been gone for 5 months, and I am single." A few guys at work are interested in me, but I don't want to cheat on him. Today I went on my first date. I wanted to feel like a woman. As we passed a late-night diner, I offered her a cup of coffee. Put on the ring and let's go, I said, handing her my trusty handkerchief to wipe away her tears. We spent the next hour at the diner, where Kelly told me all about Sergeant John Tyler. She told me about two unpleasant people at her workplace, one of whom was her boss who put pressure on her. Their constant harassment exhausted her. I advised Kelly to talk to HR and offered to take her home. We planned to have lunch together the next Saturday. I tried to visit her regularly and remind her to deal with the bullying she faced. Once every few weeks, we met to have coffee and a snack just to chat. Eventually, Kelly informed me that the company had transferred her to another department and had taken action against the two men who were causing her suffering. One day, she walked into a coffee shop with a radiant smile that was impossible to miss. "John is coming home in just 2 weeks," she said. I congratulated her, expressing my happiness for her but at the same time acknowledging that this might be our last lunch together. She was a little saddened at the thought and spoke. "Thank you for being such a good friend, Len," she said. "You helped me cope with difficult situations at work and showed me how close I was to losing the most important thing in my life, John's love. Your friendship means a lot to me, and I will always be grateful for your support." I would miss her, but when I left the restaurant, I was overcome with a sense of satisfaction. Some time later, as I was leaving my office building, I came face to face with a tall man in a military uniform whom I recognized from the photos shown to me by Kelly. "Are you Thomas Linder?" he asked. Without offering my hand, I let him take the initiative. "Can we find a place to talk?" he continued. "There's a bar a few blocks south of here. I'll meet you there." Good. When we got into our cars, he followed me. Once inside, I ordered my first drink. Kelly told me about what happened. "I wanted to talk to you directly and hear the truth from your mouth. It was incredibly hard to come home and find out that my wife confessed to going on a date. Well, it didn't happen, at least not to me or anyone else. She made a mistake in a moment of weakness, but her love for you is unshakable. Why didn't you take advantage of this opportunity? My ex-wife left me, so I understand how it hurts. I couldn't bring myself to put another person in that position, especially in uniform. Have you served before?" "No, I've never had the opportunity to make such a sacrifice. I am grateful to people like you who are ready for this. Sometimes I doubt my sanity, taking such a risk, putting my life and marriage in danger. I'm thinking about going back to school. Before serving in the Army, I studied to be an electrical engineer. If you decide to enroll at Purdue, please let me know. I have some contacts there, so if you decide to go, it might be useful." I handed him one of my business cards. "I don't think we can be friends, Linder. Every time I see you, I can't help but remember what Kelly wanted to change with you. I appreciate your actions, but am too embarrassed." "It's okay. I understand, but the offer remains valid. Even if we don't see each other anymore, call me if you need me." We sat in silence for a while, sipping beer. Finally, John spoke. "You're not like the others, Linder. You didn't fall for Kelly's advances. You're sitting here and not asking me how I spent my time. Most guys think that's what we like to discuss, but I respect your choice to speak or not. I don't need to hear about your war stories for my own amusement." With that, he finished his beer, shook my hand, thanked me, and left. After receiving a letter from Kelly, I learned that John Tyler was retiring from the Army. They were going to move to Texas so he could graduate from the University of Texas. Their plans also included starting a family after graduation. Her letter once again expressed her gratitude. I wished them good luck in their future endeavors. I hope they will serve as an example of how to overcome temptations and adversities to build a successful marriage. Despite my past, I remain a hopeless romantic. A month later, on a quiet Sunday morning, there was a knock on my front door. When I opened the door, I was stunned to see Gwen's younger brother standing on the threshold. As I passed him, I noticed her father sitting in a car parked in my driveway. "Len, Dad and I would like to talk," Pete said. I hesitated, not daring to let Gwen's father into my house. "Okay, Pete, you can come in, but your dad will have to stay in the car," I replied. Pete returned to the car to talk to his father. Although I couldn't hear their conversation, their body language spoke volumes. I fought the urge to refuse the older man. In the end, Pete returned alone. I invited him into the house and treated him to a cup of coffee. I've always enjoyed Pete's company. "You've made Dad very angry. He's furious. It's not going to be a pleasant trip home. I'm sorry, but if he ever gave me slack, I would do the same. Now that I'm not with your sister anymore, I don't have to pretend. So why don't you tell me why you're here?" "It's Gwen. Dad and I went to Brad's apartment yesterday to save her. He beat her up, leaving bruises. I'm sorry to hear that, but what does this have to do with me? It's been a year since we broke up and 6 months since we got divorced. Dad and I were hoping that you could bring her back. She cried all night, said she wanted to be your wife again, and regretted leaving you. I'm sorry she's suffering, but I can't go back to Gwen. I can't trust her again. My heart is broken by her actions. Where is she now?" "She's at the Holiday Inn. She couldn't look you in the eye, but she didn't mind when we mentioned we were coming to see you. I apologize once again. I hope she finds safety elsewhere, but not with me." I got up from the table and held out my hand, making it clear that the conversation was over. Pete reached out and took my hand, his eyes full of sadness. "I understand that you can't forgive her, but I had to try. My sister's actions have caused a lot of harm, but I want you to know that you are a good person who has always treated her well. I can't understand why she would do such a thing. Goodbye, friend." I didn't walk Pete to the door because I couldn't bear to see their terrible father again. When the car started and drove away, I realized that my connection with this family was over. Through mutual friends, I found out that Gwen had moved north and found a job at Allstate in Northbrook. During the year after my divorce from Gwen, I tried to heal my mental wounds by going on numerous one- and two-night dates. Most of the girls left with the same, if not more, sense of satisfaction as I did. Meeting Grace at a concert on the ISU campus was a delightful surprise. It was not a rock concert but a chamber orchestra from Chicago performing variations on folios by Salieri, Giannini, and other Italian composers. Sitting next to me was a petite, pixie-like girl who reminded me of Twiggy, Pattie Boyd, and other British fashion icons. My father loved George Harrison and Eric Clapton, so when Grace struck up a conversation with me during the intermission of the concert, I was pleasantly surprised. She asked if I liked the show, and I soon found out that she was studying graphics in graduate school, played the cello, and wouldn't mind having a drink with me after the concert. As a result, we ended up in a nearby pub where we shared stories over drinks. Despite her name, Grace was not from a religious background as one might assume. Her parents named her after Grace Slick, the lead singer of Jefferson Airplane. She grew up in a village near Carbondale. When I mentioned that I lived on a farm, she looked intrigued. "Do you have a garden?" she asked. I replied, "I am surrounded by my master's cornfields. There is a small plot of land about 40 by 40 feet where the previous tenant once grew vegetables, but in the 5 years that I've been living there, I haven't planted anything. Now it's just overgrown with weeds. What a pity. Gardening is such a calm, almost meditative hobby, and the taste of fresh food is just amazing." We changed the subject until it was time to leave. I walked her home, kissed her gently on the cheek at the doorstep, and shared my phone number. She didn't look like any of the girls I had dated before. The next day, I called her, and we planned to go to the student art exhibition on campus the following weekend. It was a fantastic week at work, I was promoted, and my salary was generously increased. The extra time I had spent working after the divorce had finally paid off. On Saturday afternoon, I went to pick up Grace from her apartment. The weather was great in April, and I couldn't help but think about inviting her to spend the day outside on the patio, enjoying a beer instead of sitting at home and reading student papers. When we passed through the first gallery 30 minutes later, I regretted not following my initial instinct and suggesting a pub. Most of the works presented, whether paintings or sculptures, seemed to have been created solely for the purpose of provocation. When I approached a triptych of 3 panels, it became obvious that the artist wanted to shock with an image of Mary performing fellatio on each of the members of the Holy Trinity. Although the genitals were not visible, the message was unmistakable. If this offensive piece was considered art and if Grace had anything to do with it, then our date would end soon, and further meetings would be impossible. I wanted to leave. Grace squeezed my hand reassuringly and offered to wait until the next gallery to make a decision. If your feelings remain the same after that, we can leave together. Grace led me into the next room, encouraging me to take a closer look at my surroundings. At first, I hesitated, but soon I was fascinated by the sight that opened up in front of me. In my opinion, it was art. Unlike the usual shocking and offensive works, this art was uplifting and thought-provoking, not scandalous. We walked around the hall, discussing each exhibit until we came to a painting depicting a man and a woman descending the stairs. Their faces caught my attention, making me wonder what thoughts were in their heads. It was then that I noticed the ring on the woman's left hand, holding tightly to the railing, while the man's ring finger remained bare. I couldn't take my eyes off the painting until I finally looked at the card to find out the name and the artist, L'Amour Perdu by Grace Powell Adams. Did you create this? I asked. Grace met my gaze with a smile. Yes, it's me, she smiled. Do you like it? It's amazing. Is the name in French? How does it translate? Last Valentine's Day. Now their reaction is clear, it's over for them. Why? I can't decide. What are your thoughts? I have one thought, but am not ready to discuss it yet. I'll tell you later. Have you used real models? 2 students stood on the stairs and posed for hours. Let's go to the last gallery. I have something to show you, she suggested. In the last gallery, Grace's second work hung on the wall. It was a living drawing of a huge aquarium teeming with a variety of fish and marine life. Wow, this is amazing. My niece would be thrilled. You are incredibly talented. Why is this work here and not in the first gallery with the others? Grace smiled before answering. Many of us believe that the professor curating this exhibition relies on its provocative nature to gain recognition on the avant-garde scene in Chicago. We suspect that he may be romantically involved with one of his students, the man responsible for the controversy surrounding the Holy Trinity. I hope this doesn't seem to you, rather it just demonstrates your insight. If you want, I can write a letter to the university with a proposal to move the exhibition to another gallery. After arriving at the pub, we spent several hours drinking, eating, and getting to know each other better. Grace's down-to-earth nature was truly amazing, especially considering her upbringing. She honestly shared everything with me, and I couldn't help but be impressed. As the evening drew to a close, Grace asked, "Len, do you mind if we finish the day a little earlier today? I have to have a project finished by Monday, and I really need to work on it. I know I shouldn't have been having fun all day, but I just wanted to be with you. I hope you understand." I agreed, but was at a loss about what to do or say next. The first date was amazing, and I was determined not to ruin it. Grace suggested dinner next week, and we decided that she would come to my place on Wednesday and I would cook. When Grace arrived on Wednesday at 5:30 p.m., her attention was immediately attracted by the thicket of weeds that used to be a garden. There was a 7-foot fence around it to keep the deer away. Grace took a shovel from the garage and began digging along the fence, marveling at how they were trying to keep the rabbits away by burying it. Grace washed the dishes while we happily ate a hearty stew and drank beer, talking about ourselves along the way. After we finished eating, we started talking about her painting of two lovers and how it had caused a reaction in me because of my previous marriage. Grace hastened to apologize if the painting caused me any negative emotions. As we continued to talk, she spoke more and more about herself. She was going to get a Master of Arts degree in a little over a year, was fluent in Italian and French, played the cello with talent, and was a skilled artist. I couldn't help but admire her many talents and jokingly asked, "What can't you do?" Grace laughed and replied, "I don't know how to play sports. I'm pretty clumsy, even though I've tried my hand at tennis, softball, and horseback riding. I seem to lack proficiency in anything that requires coordination. Although I can run and swim, I always end up in the last row in yoga classes." I couldn't help laughing at the thought, and Grace joined in. "It's hard to believe," I said. "To play the cello and draw, you need to have exceptional hand coordination." "I feel insecure," she admitted. "Please don't ask me to dance. I don't have rhythm, and I feel awkward on the dance floor. It's like my limbs are just hanging out. It's hard for me to draw when people are watching. I can only play the cello because I studied alone, away from prying eyes." "Didn't you have a music teacher?" "No, my mother taught me." Grace looked at her watch and realized it was time for her to return to the city. "I have to get back soon, but first, I have a big request. I'd like to set up a garden in your backyard. I'll take over all the work, buying seeds, weeding, and everything else. In return, I'll share fresh produce with you so that you can enjoy the fruits of our labor." We discussed logistics and the boundaries of my space, as well as other issues. When she agreed to my terms, I agreed to her request. The idea of fresh food was tempting, but what really captured me was the idea of Grace staying with me for 6 months. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace contacted me at work to confirm her visits, and when I returned home, I often found her working in our garden. She even rented a rotary cutter once. When she was halfway through preparing the site, I came and asked if I could help. After she demonstrated the process, I quickly mastered it. The following Friday, a large mound of organic cow manure appeared in front of the fence. Despite the rainy weather, we spent the whole weekend taking turns bringing wheelbarrows of manure and mixing it with the soil. When we finally finished, Grace hugged and kissed me, which surprised me a lot. I realized how much I had missed this feeling since I left home. The joy of working with the earth, inhaling its smell, I felt even more pleasure when the sun came out and warmed my body. It was my first time gardening, but I quickly understood its meaning. Although over the years I've watched my boss plow fields and harvest corn, I always felt disconnected from the process. Working on this small piece of land helped me to face nature face to face. After working in the garden, we returned to the house to make sandwiches for dinner. I sensed that Grace was worried about something and waited patiently for her to bring up the subject. "My lease ends in 3 weeks, right after graduation," she began. "My neighbors are moving out. Could you let me rent the second bedroom here?" Her question disappointed me a bit, as I was hoping for a more romantic relationship with her. Because of her studies, gardening, and my new promotion, we rarely talked and didn't have much time for real communication. It was obvious that Grace only saw me as a roommate and friend, not a potential romantic partner. Despite my feelings for her, I decided to agree to this offer. We sat down at the table to discuss how much she would pay for rent and groceries. I should have asked about guests. She smiled at me and asked, "What do you mean by guests?" I explained, "Well, if one of us wants to bring a guest home for the night, how is it done? I've never had roommates other than my ex-wife, so this topic is new to me. How are you and your roommates dealing with this issue now?" Grace seemed to be on the verge of tears. "We ask all guests to show respect to their neighbors. This has never been a problem before. I decided to leave this topic. I think you and I will be able to resolve this issue if it ever arises." Grace left, mentioning that she would be back next weekend to start planting. The next Saturday morning was filled with warm sunshine, a perfect spring day. Since I had several errands to run in the office, I decided to ride 10 miles to the city by bike. Before I left a note on the kitchen table for Grace, informing her of my return at 4 o'clock and suggesting that we have dinner together. When I turned on the computer, there was a black screen. Suddenly, I remembered that it was supposed to be updated over the weekend, and this fact brought a smile to my face. Despite this slight inconvenience, I was able to reflect on the wonderful morning walk I had just enjoyed and was looking forward to another one on the way home, or better yet, spending a sunny afternoon in the garden with Grace. With a sense of satisfaction, I turned off my computer and left the office, humming a tune on the way. As I drove up to the house, I noticed the closed gate and Grace's car parked inside, hidden from prying eyes. There was a garden waiting for me behind the house. I slung my bike over my shoulder and rode through the gap between the gates. When I got to the house, I looked into the garden. Grace was there, working the ground with a hoe. Startled, she called out, "Who's there?" "Stop." I plucked up the courage and confessed, "I love you, Grace." She was embarrassed. "Really?" I nodded. "Yes, for real. I don't just want to be a friend, I want to be your lover." "Then why didn't you say so earlier?" "I was stupid," I confessed. "I was trying to figure out how to express my feelings to you, hoping for something more than just friendship. I was afraid to risk our relationship if you didn't feel the same way. I was thinking the same thing about you." "Why did you think that?" "You're amazing." "Really?" "I've noticed how much you admire Janice." "Who is Janice?" she asked, confused. "My painting. And one evening, I was looking through a photo album in your room. There are some photos of Gwen in there. I'm not going to lie to you, Gwen looks good, but you look great." "Okay, I believe you. What should we do next? Should we wait for the landing?" After that, we went to the bedroom. It never occurred to me that Brad would get away with seducing my wife. Even though Gwen was also to blame for our marriage falling apart, he deserved to be punished for neglecting our vows and manipulating my wife to financially ruin me during the divorce. But I've never felt the need for hasty revenge. As my relationship with Grace grew stronger, I doubted the possibility of revenge. And yet, I knew it was important. Although I could resort to violence, I didn't want to risk going to jail. I knew I wouldn't last long in such an environment. Instead, in our digital age, keeping track of others has become a piece of cake. After my divorce from Gwen, I devoted an hour every week to searching for information using online tools. Using a pseudonym, I was able to safely immerse myself in Brad's world through Facebook and other platforms. I kept a low profile and waited for the right moment to act. The saying "revenge is a dish best served cold" turned out to be true for me. It was only 2 years after the divorce that I got a great chance. At that moment, Brad was working in the information technology department of a reputable conservative brokerage firm and was in a new relationship. I decided to save his fiancée the hassle of a divorce. It was better to take measures before the wedding. A couple of weeks before Brad's wedding to his charming young bride, I realized it was time to step in. It cost me $4,000, but it was a price worth paying. Brad's life was an open book. Every Wednesday, a group of guys from Brad's office gathered at the bar of a local hotel to have a drink and relax. It was a typical boys' party, and most of the group would leave after an hour or two, but there were always 1 or 2 single guys, including Brad, who stayed longer. He stayed up late at night, maybe until 8 or 9 o'clock. An escort from Chicago lured him into her room without much resistance. Sitting at the bar, she immediately caught Brad's attention. After saying goodbye to his last colleague, Brad approached Lacey and offered her a drink. She agreed, and for the next quarter of an hour, she succumbed to Brad's charming words. When Lacey offered him another drink, he agreed, and they decided to continue the conversation in her room. Brad didn't know that there were 2 discrete cameras in the room. Lacey introduced Brad to Philip, a work colleague. It is unclear why Brad decided to take part in this. The next day, Lacey and I watched both videos together. We decided that we should only use screenshots without showing the faces of either Lacey or Philip. I debated whether to tell Brad that I had set it up, but in the end, I decided not to do it. I didn't want to risk the revenge plot getting out of hand. Given my relationship with Grace, I've put too much at stake. Despite my doubts, I considered my revenge mission accomplished. Brad was away from home and felt defeated. The images, which were anonymously shared on the internet, will haunt him for a long time. But let me share with you what happened to Grace and me. For 15 months, we shared a house and our love in this farmhouse. It was at this time that I experienced real happiness for the first time in my life. Grace opened my eyes to new ideas, introduced me to incredible literature, and expanded my worldview. I first met her parents at a community meeting on the 4th of July. Once again, I was caught off guard by the surprises of that weekend. Their community blessed me with the most amazing Independence Day celebration I've ever experienced. As we sat on the back porch with a beer in our hands before dinner, Grace said, "Len, I got a job offer today." Judging by her tone, I realized that I probably wouldn't be thrilled about this. I was offered to work on an animated film for the Enlightenment Company, located in France. A new animated film based on the classic Charles Dickens tale, A Christmas Carol, is in development. As part of the development process, I will have to move to Paris for almost a year. Although I knew Grace's options in central Illinois were limited, the idea of moving to Paris was daunting. It sounds like an amazing opportunity. I'm a little surprised, though. I didn't know you were looking for a job abroad. I didn't do it. It's all thanks to a friend of a friend who's already there. One of my professors shared samples of my work with several people, and they contacted me today. I thought you were discussing the possibility of working as a freelancer to stay here. Freelancing can be difficult without experience or qualifications. This opportunity will help me get the necessary documents after my return. Or you'll decide that Paris is more charming than Peoria and Bloomington. What will happen to the company? I've been thinking about it, honey. You've always told me that I'm a reasonable person. You know about my deep love for the farm and, of course, my love for you. When should you give an answer? By the end of the week. You know me. I will fully support you. Give me a couple of days to recover, and then I'll give you the green light to share my answer. Grace got up from the chaise lounge and settled on my lap, her arms wrapped around my neck, and her lips met mine. I would miss her. I was wondering if I should tell her about the graduation present I had prepared for her. The diamond ring was safely stored in my gun safe. 2 days later, when I anxiously asked Grace for her consent, I did not mention the ring. Grace left the day after graduation. I tried my best to be as calm as possible, but it wasn't easy. I don't think anyone was fooled by my facade, but I was hoping Grace noticed how I was holding myself together. Grace left her car and most of her belongings, including art supplies, at my house. Grace's mom hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, "She loves you." I drove her to O'Hare Airport and kissed her goodbye. The sight of this airport always brings back painful memories of how Gwen left me there many years ago. Now it's all happening again, but this time she's flying away, and I'm staying behind. Despite our attempts to keep in touch through letters, photos, email, and Skype, the distance only made my feeling of loneliness worse. While I was struggling with depression, the crop that we planted together in the garden began to wither and rot. Our plans for our next vacation in Paris seemed like a distant dream as I struggled with the reality of her absence. One afternoon, several of my colleagues visited our house, and seeing the condition of our vegetable garden, asked if they could pick some vegetables. I didn't object and let them. Among them was Debbie King, an administrative assistant in our department, a widow with 2 sons whose husband died of severe hepatitis. On Saturday, Debbie and her boys came to us and spent several hours picking vegetables. "What are you going to do with all these vegetables?" I asked. "I really want to learn how to preserve food from my neighbor. I need to buy some cans for canning to prepare food for the winter. Fortunately, I have at least 3 dozen cans that I can give you. Just don't forget to return them if we need them next year. You never know what might happen." Grace usually does the canning, and I just help her. Debbie looked at me. "She loves you and will be back soon." I walked back into the house, muttering to myself, "I really hope so." Debbie left with her sons, a couple of boxes of groceries, and 40 cans for canning. Grace expected to get 10 days off between Christmas and the New Year's weekend, during which she planned to fly home, so we decided that the beginning of November would be the perfect time for my trip to Paris. While Grace was working on weekdays, we would have evenings and 2 weekends to enjoy each other's company. When I boarded the plane for a direct flight to Paris, I hoped that my bad luck at O'Hare was behind me. Grace was waiting for me at the entrance to the customs hall. When I woke up the next morning, I felt disoriented. When I came to my senses, I found the kitchen, where a table with a small refrigerator and a stove was waiting for me. Grace kindly left instructions for the operation of the coffee pot, and there was bread and jam for breakfast. Then I took a bath, shaved, dressed, and noticed the key hanging by the door. After walking around the neighborhood, I returned to the apartment at 4 o'clock to continue reading the book I had brought with me. Grace suddenly burst through the door. "That's it. You won't be able to avoid me for the next 64 hours. I don't mind. We don't even need to leave this room. By the way, have you noticed that there is a refrigerator in my dollhouse? We could starve to death. Isn't there a delivery service in Paris? Can we order Domino's food here?" "I'm joking, of course. We are in Paris. No one eats here before 7 o'clock. Let's make love and then go to dinner," Grace suggested. I couldn't disagree with her arguments. Our Saturday was filled with a visit to the Musée d'Orsay and a delicious lunch near Notre Dame. Grace's colleagues wanted to meet with me, but she postponed this meeting in order to spend a quiet evening together on Friday. In the end, she agreed to meet with them on Saturday evening. When Grace and I entered the restaurant that evening, we noticed that a dozen people were already sitting at a long table at the back of the hall. It was obvious that Grace was very much loved by her colleagues, so it was not surprising that they were looking forward to meeting the man who captured her heart. After exchanging introductions and greetings, we were seated in small groups. I found myself at the same table with an Englishwoman named Holly, a Japanese woman named Mummy, and a Frenchman named Claude. Mummy and Claude were fluent in English, but Holly was a little more difficult to understand. Grace moved between 2 groups, one of which spoke French and the other English. The waiter took our drink orders, and the plates of snacks kept coming and coming. Holly and I were playfully arguing about the best rock and roll artist, and Claude joined Hollis' opinion, calling the Rolling Stones album Exile on Main Street the greatest rock album ever recorded in France. Mummy, who grew up listening to her mom's cheap vinyl records recorded in Bourbon, was on my side during our discussion. Her mom, who was in the audience, shared her opinion that Elvis and Chuck Berry started it all. It was all a lot of fun, and no one took it too seriously. At one point, I turned to Grace and asked who she thought was the greatest rock singer of all time. Without hesitation, Grace replied that Grace Slick was not only the greatest rock singer but also the greatest singer in general, regardless of whether it was a man or a woman. The conversation turned from music to sports, in particular football, when Grace suddenly raised her voice and began to scold one of the Frenchmen in French. This outburst was completely out of character for Grace, as I had never seen her in such anger before. I couldn't understand what they were talking about because everyone else was speaking French and watching in amazement. The neighboring tables even stopped their conversations to listen. A minute later, Grace apologized to her colleagues and announced that we were leaving. As we were leaving the restaurant, I couldn't help but ask, "What was that?" Jean-Paul is one of those Frenchmen who can't resist making derogatory remarks about Americans. In my experience, there are a minority of such people. He took advantage of the fact that you don't speak French and told Renée some unpleasant things about American men, specifically addressing you. I overheard him and was not going to be silent. I hope you don't mind that I'm defending your honor. No, not at all, I replied, but why did we have to leave? Renée is so insensitive. Despite my dislike of Jean-Paul, she invited him anyway. To be honest, Jean-Paul is a manipulator. He even tried to ask me out, but I turned him down, confirming my devotion to you and our relationship. By the way, we're still together, right? I didn't dare bring up this topic while we were apart for fear that you would start dating someone else. From a distance, I remained steadfast in my decision. I'll be there when you get home, Len. I love you deeply. Please promise me that you will never hurt me. Before leaving, I attended another meeting with her colleagues, this time without Jean-Paul and Renée. Claude made it clear that not all French people hold the same anti-American beliefs as Jean-Paul. The evening passed pleasantly and without drama. Staying in Paris revived my hope for a future with Grace. The next 5 months seemed endless, especially because of the harsh, prolonged winter on the prairies. Grace's arrival during the holidays was a welcome change. The expectation of spring brought with it warmer temperatures and longer days, but Grace's return was still a few months away. I originally planned to spend a week in Paris in March, but Grace informed me that her work schedule was currently overloaded due to the busy season. In order to be in time for the film's holiday release, the first draft of the graphics had to be completed by mid-May. I decided to cancel my trip in the hope that Grace would be home by mid-June. On the magnificent day of the 10th of May, the weather was hot. After 3 days of rain in a row, the sun finally came out. When I was driving home from work, I couldn't wait to relax with a beer on the back porch of my house. For some reason, being there made me feel closer to Grace. Last Saturday, I spent the day in the garden using a rented rotary cultivator. Maybe I'll plant some tomatoes and string beans, a simple activity to occupy my time. Meanwhile, I was enjoying a beer and admiring the view of the place that was now called Grace's house. When I arrived at the house, I was stunned to see that the gate was closed. I parked the car and decided to go around the back of the house instead of trying to open the gate. To my surprise, the most amazing garden nymph was standing in the garden, leaning on a hoe and looking right at me. We were silent for a while, just looking at each other, and then she lowered the hoe and hugged me. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "We finished work earlier, 3 days ago. They only need half the team to finalize, fine-tune, and post-produce." When they asked who wanted to leave, I immediately raised my hand. I packed up quickly, caught the first flight to O'Hare, boarded the shuttle, and arrived home just 2 hours ago. I really hope that everything is okay. I wanted to surprise you, but I hope you don't have any plans yet. This woman can be so ignorant sometimes. It's time to bring her up to speed. Yes, I have plans. While I was thinking about it, Grace was still hugging me tightly. I carefully pulled away from her and hurried into the house to open the safe. After opening the box, I got down on one knee. "Grace, will you marry me?" I thought she could be a little clueless sometimes, so my proposal took her by surprise. It took her a while to collect her thoughts, but when she finally spoke, her response was exactly what I expected. "Yes, Thomas Linder, I love you so much." She suggested we wait until Sunday to get a marriage license and invite our relatives. So that Sunday, we exchanged vows in a beautiful garden surrounded by our loved ones. The weather was a bit damp, but the group of 20 guests, including our parents, siblings, and a few others, did not seem worried. Grace stood out in her dress at the garden wedding, which I'm sure my parents appreciated. As a result, Grace and I stayed at the farmhouse until the end of the harvest. We spent the summer looking for our own home and eventually found the perfect place a few miles north of the city, just a quarter of a mile from the river. It was far enough away to avoid flooding. The plot consisted of 4 acres of land, of which 2 acres were forested and flat enough for Grace to have her own garden. There is a 2-car garage on the plot as well as a garage that is larger than a trailer. We plan to turn the garage on the south side into a studio for Grace, providing space for both cars. As soon as the 2-car garage is completed, we intend to sell it. The foundation has already been dug, and the basement walls have been filled in by the builder, but due to bad weather, construction will have to be postponed until spring. Grace is mainly engaged in painting and also does freelance work, demonstrating her exceptional talent in this craft. Grace is a talented person engaged in gardening, freelancing, and painting. One of her paintings, Liar 80 Dessert, was sold for an impressive $8,000. Despite her busy schedule, she is happy to be able to work from home and focus on her passion for art. Grace and I are expecting our first child in May. We both want to have 3 or 4 children, so we decided not to wait. I am incredibly lucky to have such a loving and talented wife, a job that I love, a child on the way, and a beautiful piece of land that I share with my beloved wife. As for Gwen, I found out that she got married twice, and both marriages ended in divorce because of her spouse's infidelity. Gwen never gave birth to any children. She became interested in riding a motorcycle, which ended sadly for her. Gwen is now completely paralyzed and is learning to speak again. I'm very angry with Gwen, but I didn't want her to have this life. It's probably karma. And that concludes my story. Let's discuss in the comments whether the hero of this story did everything right or whether he should have done otherwise. I say goodbye to you, my dear friend. Look at my channel more often. May the force be with you.